Welcome to the second case study on the course, and this is the theme devoted to territorial partitions. And generally speaking, we're talking about the 20th century, partitions that take place in the 20th century, and there are roughly two kinds. So the first is a result of a war, and territory is divided between the victors. So this is the partitions that happen in Korea and Germany, for example. And the second is the partitions that were a result of decolonization processes and independence movements in colonial and then former colonial regions. And so our focus here is going to be on the partition of India and Pakistan, which is one of the most famous of the decolonization partitions. Other very famous examples include Ireland and Israel and Palestine. We'll touch briefly on some of the kind of more broad themes that exist across partitions, but really our focus specifically is going to be on India and Pakistan. So these kind of lecture slides are going to be divided up into three sections. So this is a massive kind of set of lecture material. There's a lot of stuff to cover. There's a lot of really important background information that I want you to have, because it's important that you have a kind of historical and political context in order to understand some of the nuances and complexities of partition and how it played out in 1947. So the first section is going to be about the British Empire in India. Partition cannot be separated from empire. They came together and they worked together. So we have to really understand how the British Empire worked in India. So I'll give an overview to the Raj, which is the name for the British colonial government in India. And then I'll talk about some of the ways that Indians resisted the Raj through forms of anti-colonial nationalism. And then really importantly, because partition was based on drawing a boundary between two religious groups, I'll talk about the rise of communalism in India. So this is the rise of an ideology that believes that there are fundamental differences, irreconcilable differences between different religious groups. And then eventually, I'll talk about kind of older practices of colonial boundary making that appear in the 19th century, and those forms of boundary making reappear in 1947 at the partition of India and Pakistan. So we talk about the early stuff so that we can understand the later stuff. And then we'll end this section with a discussion of the first partition that took place in India, and that was the partition of Bengal, which was a British province in British-controlled India in the northeast of the subcontinent. So, to take a step back, in a general sense, partition is essentially a division of one entity into multiple parts. So if you remember back to Foucault and our discussion of Foucault, he talks about the partitioning of space in order to regulate bodies. So hospitals and schools, for example, prisons. But partition has a different emphasis here in the context of 20th century history and geopolitics. The word partition refers specifically to a type of boundary making where a territory is divided on the basis of difference in political identity. We also have some important definitions from geographers over time here. So I've given you some of the ways that geographers in the 20th century and into the 21st century have conceptualized partition in an abstract sense. So a fresh border cut through at least one community's national homeland, creating at least two separate political units under different sovereigns or authorities. The division of a state so that it loses its identity or even disappears from the political map, or the creation of two or more states within a territory which had previously been subject to only one. And then at the end, this really important point by Brendan O'Leary: the ostensible purpose of a political partition, its formal justification, is that it will regulate, that is, reduce or resolve a national, ethnic, or communal conflict. And by the end of this series of lectures, what I hope that you see is that colonial violence, imperial violence, and anti-colonial violence were bound up together. And so partition can't be separated from the violence with which it's associated. So we go really far back here. The story of partition, according to historians, really begins with the British Raj, or the British colonial rule of India. So this is a criminally brief overview, but I think it's really important. So the East India Company enters India as part of a wider European age of maritime exploration and expansion, and they're competing with the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company had cornered the luxury spice trade, so the English East India Company has to think outside the box, and so they create a trade in luxury goods like textiles and fabrics, and then eventually in tea. And the English East India sets up camp. It builds infrastructure and trade networks in India. It begins to challenge the Dutch and the French for dominance in the Indian subcontinent. This history, oddly enough, has made it back into the news recently over the summer. A key part of this process, which you learned about or will learn about soon in Nature of Geographical Knowledge, is the surveying and mapping and codifying and categorizing and measuring of India for the purpose of improving knowledge and efficacy of trade. So the East India Company collected as much geographical data as they possibly could in order to mobilize it to increase profits. Eventually, the purpose becomes more about maintaining power and about enabling the East India Company's ability to administer and govern India, but early on, it's about understanding what kinds of natural resources are where in order to exploit them for money. Key to all of this is the role of maps. Maps are central to the ability of a government or a corporation or an organization to visualize the territory and then implement plans and interventions in that territory. So the early East India Company maps, like this one, were really important pieces and tools of power. Matthew Edney, who's a professor in the United States, he argues that the East India Company couldn't possibly know everything. It couldn't actually achieve totalizing knowledge of India. So while the East India Company thinks they discovered and then described the actual real India, what they actually did is create a cartographic representation that became a particular form of real India, but that is specifically a British India because it is created and narrated in the minds and the language of the British. And it is this British India that is eventually partitioned. Before the Europeans, there was already a large land-based empire running the show in India. This is the Mughal Empire. And it's quite important, actually, to think about when we think about some of the differences in the Indian population that become politicized in the 20th century. The Mughals are an important bit of history to that. They explain why some identities became salient or important in political terms. So who were the Mughals and what was their empire like? India has, for most of its history, been a pluralistic society or made up of multiple different types of societies. There were many foreign explorers, there were militaries, there were diplomats, travelers, crossed the northern mountain boundary into the subcontinent. It's a history of encounters, and the Mughals were Muslims who entered the subcontinent from Central Asia, and they were looking to expand their land empire and their trade links. And there had been Muslim activity already. The Mughal Empire conventionally is dated to 1526, but Muslim presence in India dates back much further. In 1526, a guy named Babur takes power in India. And this is really roughly concentrated in the northern part of India. The southern part of India is less central to the Mughal Empire. And 1556 is a really important year. And this is the beginning of the classical period when a guy named Akbar the Great takes over the Mughal Empire. Akbar was a fascinating dude. He was really into religious harmony. He prioritized growth in trade. He was very interested in maintaining economic success. He was also really interested in the arts, and he was interested in religious studies. So he brought leaders of many different faiths to his court. He made strong alliances with Hindu rulers. And his son, Jahangir, continued continued to rule in this same vein. This is a period of artistic flourishing, of religious and philosophical flourishing. And these are images that were made during his reign. So you can see there's a really interesting kind of period of flourishing art and architecture at the time. The third emperor is a guy named Shah Jahan. And Shah Jahan is responsible for the famous architecture of the Indian Mughals. So if you've been to India and you've seen the Red Fort or the Taj Mahal, you've most definitely seen the Taj Mahal reported in news media. And in the mid-17th century, so a couple of centuries later, the empire begins to decline because they've expanded quite far in territorial terms, and that territorial expanse becomes unwieldy. And there are a number of internal threats. So there's some rival regional groups who've amassed a bit of military power, and they start to undermine Mughal dominance. And the East India Company enters India at around this time, and they see an opportunity to take advantage. The Sikh community becomes really important in 1947, and that is partly due to a historical accident because the community is based in one of the regions in India that is eventually partitioned. And so the Sikh community is deeply affected by partition. So it's really important, I think, to talk about the relationship between Sikhism and the Mughal Empire because it tells us quite a bit about the relationship between the Sikhs and the Muslims in the 1940s. So Sikhism appears in the 1500s. It's properly said Sikh, but English speakers often say Sikh to differentiate it from the English word Sikh, which means something else. And it was founded by a man named Guru Nanak in the northwestern region of India called Punjab. Guru Nanak rejects what he believes to be the polytheism of Hinduism, and he also rejects what he believes to be the practical regulations of Islam. And Sikhism flourishes in his community, so it becomes quite popular. Nanak dies, but is replaced by a new teacher or leader, and eventually a line of 10 gurus lead the community. Sikhs worship in places called gurdwaras. So they don't worship in places called temples, they worship in places called gurdwaras. After the last guru's death, guidance is no longer sought in the form of a guru or a teacher. It's sought from the main book or the core text of Sikhism, which is called the Guru Granth Sahib. And this continues to be one of the ways that Sikhs practice. The last guru is a guy named Gobind Singh. And Gobind Singh establishes an organized community of Sikhs that he calls the Khalsa. So it's kind of like a special internal community that certain Sikhs are members of. And the Khalsa is a community of initiated members. And it becomes a group of religious, political, and social leaders. And so the Khalsa represents Sikhs in political terms and in military terms. In the 18th century, in the 1700s, the Sikh community experiences some growing tensions with the Mughal Empire. And so the Khalsa begins to militarize and organize in order to protect itself from what it sees as a threat from the Mughal government. Just a bit more information about the Sikhs and some background. This is the most sacred place for Sikhs today. This is called the Golden Temple, and it's located in Amritsar in the Punjab in India. For a brief period in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Sikhs have significant political power in the heartland of their faith, the Punjab. This region will be at the heart of what we talk about when we talk about the partition process. So in 1799, the Sikh leader Ranjit Singh takes over the city of Lahore. And he creates a Sikh empire which stretches across northwestern India. This is quite bad luck for them in a sense, because this is a strategic place for the East India Company. The East India Company sees this region of northwestern India as a borderlands. And they want to claim it for themselves because they see it as protection for the rest of their Indian empire. Ranjit Singh consolidates control of the region and does not allow the East India Company in. But the East India Company really, really want the Punjab. Ranjit Singh dies, and he leaves a very unpopular first son as his heir. And this internal strife weakens the Sikh Empire significantly, and the East India Company is there waiting to take advantage, and they make their play for the Punjab. In the 1840s, the East India Company strengthens its military forces in Punjab, and it builds a cantonment, which is essentially the word for British military forts in India, in Firozapur. And they set up a cantonment specifically to move military forces to the Punjab in preparation for a war. They annex a neighboring region, Sindh, which is located to the south of Punjab and is in current-day Pakistan. And this escalates tensions between the East India Company military and the Sikh Empire. And war breaks out. And after a few battles, an uneasy treaty is signed. And as part of that treaty, the Sikhs are forced to give up parts of central Punjab. And this ends the period of expansion by the East India Company, and it begins a period of imperial consolidation. So they ramp up their surveys and maps, and they begin to take the idea of a census more seriously. So they've gathered all of their maps, they've gathered all of their geographical data. Now they want to know more about the people who live in India. They want to know about the population that they're ruling. So they start to decide that they want to count all of the people in the population, right? And we talked about this when we talked at the very start about the relationship between the state and individual bodies and discipline and punish when we talked about Foucault. So in 1857 is a key date in Indian history, by the way. 1857, there's a massive rebellion among troops in northern India. Indians call this the First War of Independence. And this means that the East India Company is eventually stripped of their power, and rule is taken over directly by the British Parliament. So this is when Queen Victoria is established as Empress, and India enters the final stage of empire. 1857, transition from corporate rule by the East India Company to direct parliamentary rule, and Victoria becomes the Empress of India. Meanwhile, Indians are not just doing nothing, right? They are resisting, and they are living their lives, and they are building communities. They're finding ways of negotiating with British power. A middle class is developing. Many members of the Indian middle class were educated in Europe, including Britain, of course. And this class of Indian intellectuals are responding to colonialism in a variety of really interesting and important ways. Often they're reimagining and reforming Indian religious, cultural, and social tradition. Manu Goswami, who's a historian of South Asia, identifies this process as one where Indians are responding to and appropriating modes of European modernization for their own ends. So they're going to Europe, they're learning lots of stuff, they're bringing the things they've learned back to India, they're philosophizing and they're writing about and they're enacting the things that they've seen, but in their own way. So they're appropriating and making it their own. And this develops, unsurprisingly, into an anti-colonial philosophy, right? So there's increasing political organization, there's agitation, and eventually there are calls for and a successful independence movement. But earlier on, if we take a step back, there are a number of reformers who appear in the 19th century who are philosophers and religious leaders who become really important in the 20th century. So Syed Ahmed Khan, this guy was a Muslim reformer. He was not a nationalist, and he was writing about Indian history and Indian society in the middle of the 19th century. He was educated in Europe. He was an honorary doctor of law at the University of Edinburgh, in fact. And he is most famous for devising what is now called the two-nation theory. The two-nation theory was essentially the idea that India was made up of two separate nations, a Muslim nation and a Hindu nation. And this leads us to questions about this word communalism. The British colonial administration at this time is becoming more consolidated, and it's also becoming more complicated. So they're rearranging territorial boundaries, specifically to facilitate policing and taxation. But they're also looking to manage and understand their colonized subject population. And they do this through ethnological surveys, through censuses, through map making and atlas making. And they begin systematically classifying the population of India based on categories of difference. So they use categories like class, caste, race, language, religion, and they use these categories specifically for governance and for lawmaking and for educating the British public about the British Empire in India. So the rise of the word communalism appears to refer to members of different religions, specifically to relations between religious groups. So because the British government saw religion as a category by which they could make political meaning, and as a category through which they could understand the diversity of the Indian population, Indians themselves find their lives controlled and manipulated through the lens of religion. So certain laws in India only apply to Hindus, for example. Other laws only apply to Muslims, for example. And so in this way, the government actually reinforces and solidifies religious differences between Indians that may not actually have been there in the same way before British power is consolidated. And Gayan Pandey, who's a subaltern studies scholar, writes a lot about this process. And he argues that communalism, which refers to the relations between religious groups, is a specifically colonialist idea because religious difference takes on a different meaning in European context. The history of pre-colonial religion in India is extremely difficult to get at because so much of the historical record that we have is a colonial record. So we don't really have an accurate, kind of so-called accurate window into the past to what it might have been like to be a Hindu or a Muslim person in, say, the year 1501. What we have is a colonial record, a record that's been created by the British Empire. And because of that, all of the records that we use have a colonial lens or tint to them. So we need to be aware of that when we read the historical record. Communal thinking starts to become prominent. Colonial rule is developing. The middle class of Indians is forming. And in 1885, the Indian National Congress is founded. It's oddly enough founded by British officials for the purpose of cultivating so-called educated class of Indians who could rule on behalf of the foreign government. But obviously that comes back to bite them in the butt in a very serious way. Congress is made up of a mix of intellectuals. It's generally more Hindu than Muslim or Sikh. Syed Ahmed Khan, for example, did not like the Congress Party, but it likes to think of itself as being open to any Indian who might want to join. But the government is also thinking beyond Indian borders. So the late 19th century is a really significant era in European history. So you may perhaps remember from previous courses or other knowledge that you might have from school. The late 19th century sees European nation states starting to battle it out in colonial regions. And so European nation states are working through and negotiating a balance of power, but they're using colonial territory as a proxy to settle these spats back home. So often kind of people will go to the scramble for Africa. India is subject to very similar European colonial spats. So remember a couple of slides ago, the annexation of the Punjab? Part of the annexation of Punjab was about creating a buffer zone between Russia and India. So this is part of a wider imperial process, right? And part of the plan includes granting some autonomy to tribal groups in Afghanistan who will act as a buffer. So it's not just taking the Punjab from the Sikhs, it's also creating alliances with tribal groups in Afghanistan who will act as kind of mercenaries to function like a buffer between the Indian colony proper and Russia. And in order to do this, they have to draw a new boundary. This is called the Durand Line, and that is because it was agreed by a guy named Mortimer Durand. And it was agreed with a tribal leader named Abdurrahman Khan, who was the Emir of Afghanistan at the time. And the agreement was that the tribal groups would keep the Russians away from India. And so this involves establishing a boundary commission. Remember boundary commissions from the US-Mexico border. And the commission surveyed the region, and the line was established in 1896. It is still called the Durand Line, and it is the boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And this represents the beginnings of workable boundaries based on a combination of cultural and social and political and physical lines. But it's really important to remember that this boundary is different from the partition boundary that comes into play a few decades later, because this is a colonial boundary and it was drawn in the service of the empire. And this is the final bit for today's slides. This is another really important boundary, and these are both precursors to partition. This is the partition of Bengal. Bengal is a large province in northeast India. Calcutta is the main city, which is the capital of the British colonial government. This is one of the early places to be established under British colonial rule. And Bengal is getting big. It's getting unwieldy. To give you an idea, it's roughly the same size as the country of France. So to make administration easier and to try to curb anti-colonial nationalist activity, which is becoming more and more prominent, in 1905, Viceroy Lord Curzon, you may have heard of him, partitions Bengal into the east and the west. The east is primarily Hindu and includes Calcutta, and the west is primarily Muslim. This does not go well. It goes really badly, actually, and it meets generally with opposition from the Congress Party and other Hindus. And some Muslims in the east support it, but that's because they're hoping to inspire some development in the east. Most of the development lies around Calcutta, the city of Calcutta, the capital city. And so Muslims in the east are hoping that this will mean that there's a redistribution of wealth and development. But it goes really badly. There's very little public support for the partition of Bengal. And in 1911, just 6 years later, Bengal is reunified. A lot of historians think about the partition of Bengal as a kind of precursor to the partition of India and Pakistan that comes later in 1947. I think they're really different, and I think it's really important to specify Bengal was a colonial partition designed to ease the administrative burdens on the colonial government. The partition of India and Pakistan is a decolonizing partition, and it functions as a very different process, and it has the consent, to a certain extent, of certain privileged and powerful Indian representatives. So it is a very different kind of process. That's it for part 1. Head over to part 2 when you're ready. We'll talk about anti-colonial nationalism specifically in part 2.